this has followed her from the National Museum in Oxford, England, to an archaeological site in Western Turkey, to the Okinawa Institute for Science and Technology in Japan. Kristen was able to apply these particular skills to Thornton Dial's work in partnership with us, the High Museum of Art, while employed at the Atlanta Art Conservation Center. She's currently the Assistant Objects Conservator in the Conservation and Science Department at the Art Institute of Chicago. So after I give you a brief introduction to this project and the artist whose work it serves, Paula and Kristen will give some insight into their respective roles in designing and executing our conservation study. And then we'll all sit down together for a conversation that we hope will include your questions, and if you wouldn't mind holding them until the end of our presentations. So I wanted to start with a project timeline, because this is something that we're so excited to share with you because it's been many years in the making. It began really in 2018 when we applied for a grant from Bank of America. They do an annual masterpiece grant. And in 2018, we wrote a proposal to do in-depth structural and surface analysis of Dial's most complex painted assemblages. And the fact that we got this grant is really a historic milestone because this is a grant that usually goes to more canonical masterpieces of mostly Western art, you might say. So for instance, in 2019, the year that we were awarded the grant, the marquee work of our grant cohort was Vincent van Gogh's Starry, Starry Night. So this is really kind of putting Dial's work on par with work of that kind of mastery and stature. And in 2019, after we received the grant, we began this process of structural and surface analysis through X-ray and Lepton's transformation imaging, which we'll again talk about a lot more tonight. And from that analysis, the conservators who were involved were able to make many very detailed conservation reports and treatments in the year 2021, and kind of report back to us at the High Museum about what they recommended to be done to each artwork. That same year, we received a very historic grant from the Sarah Giles Moore Foundation, who I mentioned at the outset of the talk as the funder of this program, which is enabling unprecedented conservation and collections care across the institution. And this means that this past year, we've been able to actually treat 8 out of the 10 painted assemblages that we set out to treat. So again, we began with the analysis in 2019, the kind of treatment reports in 2021, and this year we've been able, with a team of conservators who are actually here in the audience tonight, so raise your hand if you've conserved the Thornton Dial work in the past 12 months. It's really a team effort. Even because for a single Thornton Dial work, you need people who have backgrounds in textiles, painting, object conservation. So it's been a real learning experience for all of us, just kind of how many heads need to be connecting and how many people need to be at the table when we're talking about how to take care of this work. So for those of you who don't know Thornton Dial, let me introduce you to him ever so briefly. He was born in Abel, Alabama, and moved to Bessemer as a very young man, a teenager, in 1941, and almost immediately entered the workforce and did all different kinds of things. And I've listed some of his trades there, but everything from highway construction to pipe fitting, house painting, and ultimately metalworking. He did begin kind of long-term employment in the Pullman Standard Company, which was a metal factory that placed in boxcars primarily for the rail industry. And he worked there for many years, but while he was working there, he was doing all kinds of creative things on the side. That said, he wasn't comfortable sharing those creations and that artistic sensibility and talent that he had with the world, being a Black man living and coming of age in the Jim Crow South and under this kind of shadow of constant racial terror. And so he didn't share his artwork with the world for many decades. He married in 1951. They settled in Pike Shop, Alabama, he and his wife, Claire Merrie. They raised 5 children, including one who suffered from cerebral palsy. So their lives were very busy. And after the Pullman steel plant closed in about 1983, he began a metal furniture company. And craftsperson and an artist. And then things really broke open for him in 1987 when an artist called Lonnie Holley, who's based here in Atlanta, but not here tonight, I don't see him in the audience, unfortunately, he had met Dial years earlier through a girlfriend of his at the time. And Dial had shared with him a beautiful fishing lure, which was one of the many things that he made throughout those years. And Lonnie had it in his home and showed it to William S. Arnett, who was interested in discovering and revealing to the world what he knew to be true, which was that there was a great tradition of visual art in the Black South, and it just hadn't yet been recognized. And so Lonnie introduced Bill to Dial in 1987, and that really enabled Dial to start sharing his artwork with the world. And things moved quickly. In 1992, he had his first major museum exhibition it was a joint show between the New Museum in New York and the Museum of Folk Art at that time. And in 1996, we began collecting his work because that was the time when the High founded a department and a curatorship dedicated to artists who'd never been formally trained, like Thornton Dial. And then in 2011, there was a major retrospective of his work that was actually organized by the High's first curator of folk and self-taught art, Joanne Cubbs, but she organized it for the Indianapolis Museum, and it traveled all around the country, including here, and maybe some of you saw it when it came here. And then in 2014, his work really starts to enter the collections of many, many more museums, thanks to the acquisition partnerships of the Souls Grown Deep Foundation, which I'll talk about a little bit more later. And he passed away in 2016. We had a memorial show for him here. Maybe some of you got to see that. But the High has had this collection of his work since the 90s, and this is one of the earliest works that we brought into the collection. And when I joined the museum, I really wanted to make sure that we were able to represent Dial through a very large array of work, not just what we already had in the collection, which was mostly work from the 1990s, but work that demonstrated his artistic evolution and mastery of his craft through really up until his death in 2016. So we partnered with the Souls Grown Deep Foundation on a major acquisition in 2017, which brought 13 major painted Dial assemblages into the collection, including the one that we're standing in front of tonight. And this is a truly extraordinary work because it's the largest one that Dial ever made, and its subject matter really kind of matches the gravity of the legacy that he's addressing, which is the history of and the victims of the transatlantic slave trade. And so if you're looking at it, you can see, I might just try to project while I walk towards it. He's arranged his materials kind of around the edges of the piece in a way that suggests a ship that had sunk beneath the surface. And so it's really this kind of homage to lives lost, but done in a way that is very much playing, on water, the beauty of water, and the potential for rebirth that water also brings. And with this work, just looking at it even from your seats, you can kind of maybe start to anticipate what some of the conservation challenges of Dial's work really are, which are that he was using all different kinds of material. He was using clothing, old shoes, metal fencing, chicken wire, wood, and all kinds of very elaborately crafted surfaces that make all these things touch. And so this is really one of the major challenges of his work, is the kinds of interactions between material and the fact that the material that he was using was already aged, was already used. And that was something that he really valued. So he said many things throughout his life that honored his choice of materials and the fact that he wasn't just using this material because it was available to him. He was using it because he wanted to essentially create a new legacy through his artwork of the stories that these objects told about the lives that they had once touched. So he said, "When I start making something, I gather up the pieces I want to work with. I only want materials that have been used by people, the works of the United States that did people some good, but once they got service out of them, they throw them away. So I pick it up and I make something new out of it."
And what I'm showing you on the slide is an image of his studio and the way that he gathered material and preserved it until he was ready to use it. And now, just briefly, I'm going to try to give you a sense of some of the works that were involved in this conservation study and the fact that his choice of materials was very much intertwined with the meaning of the work and the message that he was trying to send. So that's another reason why they're so important and deserve respect. This is a piece called Surviving the Frost that he made as a tribute to the love of his life, his wife, Clara Murrow, after she passed away. And he's made it not just about her death. And when you look at it, you can maybe kind of see, it brings up, for me at least, roses placed on a grave, on a coffin that's being interred. But what the work is also about is the way that Earth regenerates itself, right? Despite the ways that we are constantly degrading it, despite our kind of consumption and use of materials like plastics, which really form the grounding that you see in this work. So all of those kind of stone-like elements that look like the earth itself, those are kind of wadded up plastic coverings and paper bags that he's then painted. And so we're going to see a lot more about the difficulties that presents from Paula in a few minutes. This is a series of work really that used to be behind you. So the contemporary galleries rotate with frequency. We bring in new work all the time. But this is a really important series of work that Dial did responding to the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And this is a piece he made called Driving to the End of the World, where he essentially, upon discovering the body of an old truck in the woods, he took that body, he performed surgery on it, and remade it into this series of 4 wall relief panels and 1 freestanding sculpture that, to him, are really kind of providing this narrative around the way that capitalism and greed are creating this dependency on oil that's driving us to the end of the world. And then lastly, Looking Out the Windows is a piece that he made in tribute to the young victims of 9/11, to the children who were in the World Trade Center daycare center who perished. And this is a piece that I'll show you a detail so you can kind of see the materials a little bit better. Again, the materials that he's choosing for the work has so much to do with the story, with the narrative that he's trying to tell. In this case, he's using lots of children's toys, old teddy bears, plastic dolls. One of the most deteriorating parts of the sculpture is a plastic ping pong paddle. So he's taking these things, these children's things, to speak about childhoods that were lost, essentially. And another reason that this piece is really important is because you can see the way that he wove these surfaces. He layered them with all different kinds of material and used things like textile carpet rope to create these very complex webs that do have a structural function, that do really hold a lot of these things in place. But then one of the kind of downsides of these layered surfaces is that we really can't see with the naked eye what is going on in these works, what is structural, what is holding what in place, what might be moving over time. And that's why we developed this process of both looking through his work with X-ray, and Paula will give us a little taste of that in a moment, and also looking across his work. So not just seeing what's under the surface, but trying as best we can through RTI, the process that Kristen will talk about, to really record and map the complex surfaces and topographies of his work. And so with that, I'm going to invite Paula up to the stage to give us a little bit more about her background and involvement on the project.
All right, hello everybody. I am first just want to start off and say thank you to Katie for inviting me to come this evening. I'm very excited to be here, happy to share sort of my experience with the Thornton Dial conservation project here at the High. So I'm just excited to be here. Katie sort of, can you not hear me? Come closer. Come closer. Better? Okay, all right. Now I can't see. So as Katie mentioned, I am currently the collections manager and registrar at the Wiregrass Museum of Art in Dothan, Alabama. It's a position I've held for almost a year now. And before I made the move to the Wiregrass Museum, I worked at the High for close to 20 years. Did multiple roles in the Registrar's department. And sort of the last role, which I'm especially kind of proud of, was the collections manager here at the High Museum. And the reason I'm so proud of it is because it was a newly created position for the museum. We didn't have a collections manager before that. And so the goal of a collections manager, and here especially, is just sort of as a means to address the rapid growth of the permanent collection and ultimately its care. The Thornton Dial Conservation Project is a great example of this need, both in growth. As Katie explained, we acquired 13 Thornton Dial pieces in 2017 through the Souls Grown Deep Foundation, and also through the study and care for this important and complex group of works. Just to give a little bit of context as to sort of why this project is important to the museum and to the High's collection of dial works, and kind of to reiterate what Katie was saying, is I just kind of wanted to share the core of what collections care is all about. It's caring for and honoring the collection through state-of-the-art storage and preservation and through conservation treatments. It's striving to ensure that the collection is accessible both physically and intellectually when objects are needed for display, loan, or study, and while also monitoring the location and use and condition of the work of art. So here, a great example of some conservation happening on Thornton Dial's pieces in the center. We have two conservators from the Atlanta Art Conservation Center. One specializes in paintings and the other in objects conservation. And they are working on looking out the windows. And then just on the two slides are kind of just an example of what storage in a museum would look like. You have textile screens for rolled textiles on the left, and then some compact custom storage and screens for works on paper and different type of materials there. All right, so in the fall of 2019, we set out to complete a full assessment of the 10 most significant and complex Thornton Dial works in the High's collection, using analytical and imaging techniques to capture each work's intricacy and create a baseline understanding of Dial's fabrication practices and how his materials deteriorated over time. Not only has the project facilitated the preservation of Dial's most important assemblages, but it also provides the basis for important scholarship on his materials and methods, and establishes protocols for the conservation of his work, extending to the entire array of self-taught artists working in non-traditional and mixed media. And I think Katie said this, but it's sort of important to note that the High currently holds the largest public collection of Dial's works, including paintings and assemblages for his entire 30-year career. Right, fun stuff. Okay. So working with the conservators at Williamstown and Atlanta Art Conservation Centers, a visual examination of the assemblages was conducted to document the work's present condition. Samples were also taken for scientific analysis. The conservators spent about a week in the galleries at the High Museum and in off-site storage for these examinations. They documented their initial findings by annotating printed images of Dial's works and taking detailed photographs of areas of condition concern. So on the left here is sort of one of those detailed shots, shows loss on this piece, which is surviving the frost. And if we go to the next slide, this is a great example of sort of how notes were taken. They marked up these images to note losses, and where samples were taken, they made comments on the materials that they saw just visually, and then also current condition, potential treatment options, and from this just sort of gave the foundation for their reporting. Another good example, this is the work Heckle and Jekyll, Pleasure for the People, which was completed in 1992. And again, detailed images were taken of the condition. There's losses that were noted in the annotated pictures. And again, just a full list of what they saw, materials and then condition and sort of where to go next. Yes. Yep. I can't. Let me see if I can see it from even here. Yeah, they would like note different colors for losses and things like that. All right, and at the conclusion of the assessments, these notes, in addition to the results of scientific analysis and imaging, were combined into a formal written report that included conservation maintenance recommendations and treatment proposals. During this time, we also had to think critically about the process and procedures for the next phase of the project, the study of the structure of the works, using an industrial digital X-ray system. X-radiography, or X-ray, allows us to establish construction methods and material relationships not visible through direct examination. So this is a look at sort of what we came up with for our X-ray system. So we brought in local X-ray technicians and art handlers to advise and assist with the construction of this hanging system, so that it would be appropriate for their X-ray process, but also substantial enough to securely hold these large-scale, heavy assemblages. The largest works that we did were approximately 100 by 80 inches with depths as deep as 13 inches. A hanging system for the artworks was built to fit onto an empty rolling textile storage rail. As you can kind of see the railing there on the pictures on the left. It was also able to accommodate a variety of hanging hardware that Dial used, like cleats and D-rings, and could be adjusted for height as necessary. It was constructed of wood to minimize its visibility on the X-ray images. Once we had the system in place, the X-rays were conducted by a local team from Applied Technical Services Incorporated. They utilized digital X-ray scanning system and software typically used in the medical field. So this is a sort of example of what their setup looked like in storage. And Katie's going to just point out, they had all their computers set up, but this machine here on the floor is the developer for the film, the X-ray film. So they would the process would require them to get the image, and then it would go into this developer, and then send the image sort of like a scan to the computer, and we could actually see it real time for what they were, what sort of section they were doing. Due to the size of the objects, we could not simply take one large overall X-ray. Instead, once the artworks were hung, the technicians placed numbered tapes on the reverse of the works to establish a grid. And that picture on the far right is sort of them setting up their tapes behind the pieces. The plates were attached to the reverse, the plates were approximately 14 by 17 inches in size. And they were placed on the reverse, exposed to X radiation, developed, and then saved to the computer. And then they relocated along the grid until the entire X-ray was complete. The numbered tape is visible in the X-rays and helped to guide the conservation technician at Williamstown Art Conservation Center as he stitched together the separate images into a composite X-ray of the artwork, creating the full image you see here on the right. This work, titled Heading for Higher Paying Jobs, is constructed on a substrate of canvas mounted on wood with staples over the reverse frame. Strips and sheets of metal, found wood branches, plywood, and cloth are attached to the surface mechanically with nails or with splash zone compound. The technicians had to take 46 individual X-rays of this work, 40 for the overall shot and 6 for details. The metal sheets and strips are most prominent, appearing white in the X-ray shown here due to their density. And in this detail image of the deer head, the X-ray helped conservators identify the materials Dial used to create this projecting element. He used strips of metal and board as a substructure, and then he built on it to create the image of the deer head using textile and splash zone. In addition to standard digital imaging, objects conservator Kristen Gillette performed reflectance transformation imaging. This process documents the topography of the assemblages and gives us information as to changing shape and slumping over time. And for more on this, I will hand it over to Kristen.
I'd also like to say my thanks to the High Museum and Katie for inviting me to join. As she mentioned before, I've had the opportunity to do this process in various ways, but this project in particular was the largest scale of reflectance transformation imaging I've ever had to do. So it was a unique experience with some challenges, which provided a kind of a base level for all of my projects going forward. So reflectance transformation imaging, or RTI, is a computational photographic method that captures a subject's surface shape, color, and enables the interactive relighting of the subject from any direction. In practical terms, it is a digital compilation of a set of images with varying directional light that allows the viewer to virtually alter the lighting conditions after the fact. Just a couple graphics here to help illustrate that. What you have is a camera, stays in a fixed position. You have your object, which also stays in a fixed position. And then your light is the variable that moves. So you have a light at a position, a specific angle, an image is taken, the light is moved, another image is taken, and so on until you have a minimum of about 60 images, depending on the size of the object. There are two primary methods by which RTI is captured. This is the highlight method. It's the most manual method, but also the most accessible. That's one of the great things about this process. It's very inexpensive. It's also adjustable based on your availability of equipment. And all it requires is small spheres or spheres in relation to the size of your object. You can kind of see in the image there's a couple of marble-sized ball bearings on the table there. And then you have, in this case, the object is a primarily 2D object, and then you have your stationary camera, which is overhead. More often you do see overhead RTI. It is fairly straightforward in that way, and it can be pretty standardized and repeatable. A little hard to see, there are yellow pieces of tape on that piece of paper on the table, which mark equidistant points, 12 points all the way around the center of the table. So I'm able to move my light at the same position generally. I am a human, so a little bit off each time. And then that arc is actually made manually by me, so I can have similar positions in angle direction towards the object each time. So that streamlines the process a bit. There's a couple of other different methods that other people used. And then you have to have reduced incident light. So this is in a room with no windows, no other light, except for, in this case, a flash, but you can also use a flashlight or any other light source with continual light. The other method is the dome method, which is a little bit more specialized. Each one is individual. This particular one was at the Ashmolean Museum, but it was part of a project working with cuneiform tablets and was donated to the museum. So it's bespoke, created by one individual who has placed LED lights on the inside of this dome, and they are all in sequence with a computer program which syncs the lights turning on and off with the shutter of the camera. That is also a great process because it requires a lot less manual labor. You can just kind of set it and forget it and come back and produce your image afterward, as opposed to when you're doing it with the highlight method where you have to be physically moving the light each time. For our case, we used the highlight method due to the size of the objects, but also it was slightly different because we were doing it vertically, which changes some of the environment and a way that we can create a good image. So as there's a ceiling and a floor that truncates the circle that we would want to get around it. And in order to compensate for that, we add additional points closer to the object at more raking light in order to get better cast shadows on the object. One of the other issues we had in this space was a post, which you can see to the left there, which if I stood at the same position that I had on the other side, I would be casting the shadow of the post on the object. So we had to adjust our positioning as well for that. We used the same frame for this process as we did for the X-ray, but we added a curtain because one of the issues that happens when you're producing these images, if incident light is around, it can reflect off the spheres and create a false position of the light. So reducing any light around it is really important in getting the process to work smoothly. The spheres we use in this process, because of the size of the object, are actually billiard balls that have been threaded onto a rod and then held in place by a tripod. And then at the beginning of each process, I would take a designation photo to get standard lighting and just a clear image for comparison of the object under normal visualization conditions. You can't really see in this photo, but I've taped out the floor so that I use same points again, like I did on the table in distance. But instead of having a standard wooden arc, I used my person to help me kind of standardize my light positions. So it was standing on the ground, moving around in an arc around the object. I used my ankles, my knees, my hips, my shoulders, and on up. And then I took a ladder, and I went from point to point to point, and I went from various rungs on the ladder, and then holding above my head. So I was able to do this process alone with a shutter remote for the camera. And I took about 200 images per object. Once we got going, it was about 20 minutes per object. So not terribly long, but if there's an issue with the images post-processing, the whole thing has to be done again. Just as an example of the kind of things we're looking to see when we get these images processed, again, Heckle and Jekyll, Pleasure for the People. The one on the top left is just a standard capture from the viewer software, which I'll show you in a minute here, with the light at a specific position. The one on the bottom is actually an interesting thing that you can do with RTI, where the stacking digital compilation of all the images actually allows you to create a topographical normals map of the surface, which is, in theory, reproducible if you wanted to do some sort of 3D digitization. But again, it's only 2D. You're only getting a surface as opposed to around an entire object. And then on the top right, you have specular enhancement, which is kind of an average of the highlight points, which gives it a kind of shiny appearance. And that can be adjusted as well in the software to reduce or increase the amount of highlight, as well as saturation of color. So in the case of Dial, we had a lot of issues with really discerning materials next to each other because of his color choices in paint. You can get bogged down with the amount of colors and distraction of materials next to each other. So this is a really helpful tool to desaturate that and really get an idea of the physicality of the surface. So I'm actually going to pop out of the slideshow for a moment and give you a close-up of what we have done here. So I'm going to start back at the beginning here. So this is the viewer software, which is a freeware provided by the Cultural Heritage Imaging nonprofit organization, which does various types of imaging for cultural heritage. And this is a free download. So if you had an RTI file, this would be something that you could use to view the images as well. So this is heading for the higher paying jobs and its final RTI file. And as you can see, I'm putting my cursor on the little ball here and I'm just turning it around. So you can move the light around here. which brings up an interesting point. There were a few of the panels we did not do RTI on. The Driving to the End of the World series, as Katie mentioned earlier, and Looking Out Through the Windows, the one with all the toys on it, because their dimensionality actually causes too many shadows of its own self to cast on itself, to be repetitive. It doesn't give the best result in terms of what you're actually seeing of surface, because you're just moving shadows around, basically. You can also take screenshots of your position. You can zoom in and out, if I can get my cursor to go. So I can come in close, and I can move it around. I'll go up to this head up here in the corner. We can do our normals visualization. And then we can do our specular enhancement, and I can take the color all the way down. I can increase the specularity, it's already up all the way. And I can adjust the highlight size. And then I can move our light around again. And that's a very brief overview. If there's any technical questions, we can answer them in the Q&A portion of this. I'll just head it back to Katie, who's going to close us out.
All right, thank you, Kristen. Thank you, Paula. So before we open up for questions, I just wanted to briefly reiterate that, these studies are not only so important for our museum, for our collections care, because now we have these unprecedented benchmarks of what is going on in the layers of Dial's materials, what is happening across the surfaces, but it also really has outcomes for our whole field. So already, Kristen and some of her colleagues at the Williamstown Art Conservation Center have published an entire issue of their journal, the Art Conservation Digital. So this is available online, it's free. And they've dedicated the whole thing to Thornton Dial. This was published last winter, and it includes a lot of the kinds of results that we are talking about tonight, and many, many, many other studies of his materials. So this is a huge deal, because there's never really been this kind of conservation research on Dial's work at all. And then it's also very important because his work is, again, appearing more and more in institutions all over the world, from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and I'm showing you an image on the left of an exhibition that they did in 2018, History Refused to Die, that was named for one of his works. And then on the right, I'm showing you an image that's on the website currently of the Royal Academy of Art, who are planning a big exhibition in 2023 that's going to include a lot of his work. But all to say that, we're not only taking care of our collection of Thornton Dials, but we're also creating best practices and conservation scholarship that are going to help our colleagues who are now becoming more and more interested and invested in his work, not just exhibiting it, which they've been doing maybe since the 90s, but actually collecting it and making it part of their permanent collections. So we're going to end there and open up for questions. And I have plenty of questions to ask my colleagues, but I'd love to hear from the audience if there's anybody who wants to get us started as well.
Hello.
There were different parts that were done here. The kind of visual analysis of work that was on view in our galleries, like of this work, for instance, was done in the galleries. But the X-radiography, the RTI that Kristen was talking about, that was all done off-site in our storage facility, which is where a lot of those works live while they're not on view anyway, in addition to being a secure environment for this kind of thing. Yeah.
And I'll just add, that the High is in the past done X-rays on other objects in the collection, and they've been small, and they've been able to go to, for example, Grady, because the medical field has the best X-rays out there. So this was the first time bringing a company in to set up this large scale sort of space and really do it to get the whole piece and not have to transport these large pieces to somewhere where they'd probably have to build a room for them or something. So.
And just an anecdote about that, Paula, you kind of put out a bid, right? Or you got multiple bids from different X-ray companies to be involved in this. And the one that we worked with, as Paula mentioned, Applied Technical Services. They do medical and airport security. Like, this was a totally new world for them. It was fun, like the few times that I did meet with them, because you couldn't really be there while they were X-raying. It wasn't, safe to be in the room when that was happening for the most part. But they were just totally enthralled, not only by being in the storage vault of a museum, but by never having encountered an artist like Thornton Dial for sure. And so that was kind of a fun part of the collaboration too. Was seeing these kind of technicians respond to an artist that was totally new to them, and I hope, eye-opening. Yeah.
Any more questions?
I have a question about the RTI. I didn't understand how the spheres, what are those about?
So if it's good to do in contrast with the dome method. When you have your set positions like that, it already has a fixed map of where those light positions are coming from in the dome. So when you have the highlight method, you have to have something that the algorithm can use to pinpoint the direction of the light.
So the spheres stay in the same place?
They stay stationary, yes. Yeah. So at the end, you'll have a compiled image of the sphere as well as part of the process, and it'll have all your little light positions on it as well.
Was that RTI, was that developed specifically for art conservation, or was there other uses like in structural engineering or, whatever?
So the early stages of it, they used what they called polynomial texture maps. I believe that's what they're called. And it was, RTI as we know it was developed with Hewlett-Packard, the company, not the people. And as far as I know, the main uses of it have been with cultural heritage or research in these kinds of fields. But I'm not, that is the world that I research the most, so I wouldn't know clearly. But it's been used, like that dome was used for, see if I can remember the acronym, the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative, which is a program that works across universities all over the world, which have cuneiform tablets with cuneiform script on them, so that scholars don't have to travel, say, to Chicago or California or Boston or England to see these tablets in person. They can view them online, and the raking light is great for things like that.
I'm wondering, like, for you who worked with this art and know this art so well, what these other dimensions and layers and understanding the engineering of these works has done to your thinking about the work?
I mean, for me, just being able to see them closer, right? To understand really what he was doing, how he was constructing things. I mean, there was I think we found a spider on one of the pieces, clearly under paint, and it was just there for eternity, or as long as that is. But when you spend so much time with it as well, you're seeing new things every time you look at the piece. And so having the X-rays and having the RTIs just sort of opened my eyes to kind of how difficult that must have been to create and how much time he must have spent on it. And I enjoyed it a lot more, like being able to just kind of spend time with it.
It definitely it makes you appreciate too just his mastery of material, right? And the way that he could transform so many different kinds of media and really bend them to his will. And something we didn't talk about tonight, just because it would have been too much, but there was a lot of attention to and study of his use of splash zone in our conservation analysis. And splash zone, for those of you who don't know, is a kind of industrial putty that's used to seal pipes or cracks in pools and water features. And it was something that Holly, his friend, told us Thornton's brother brought home because he was working in a pipe factory at that time, and they both started using. And Dial was using it not only as an adhesive, but as a kind of sculptural material, right? But one thing that our conservators learned by trying to recreate splash, like they were essentially trying to do like a rapid aging test of splash zones so that we can understand like what is the half-life of this material, like how long before it's going to need to be reinforced when it's used as an adherent. And so they were basically recreating the way that he used splash zone. And when you see him, there are films, you know, that capture him kind of curing it and mixing it and that sort of thing. But it just gives you an appreciation of like the fact that he had all this knowledge of how to use this material, like how to get it to the exact consistency that he wanted it, where it was like pliable but not too runny, and was going to be able to be this kind of sculptural material, right? And so again, it just gives you a different kind of respect for the ways that he learned to use materials and master materials and bring them all together in these complex artworks. So that's been something for me, and I don't think that it hasn't like been revelatory in the sense of making me think differently about how his work evolved over time, because he was always kind of going back and forth, I think, in his artistic practice, and never stopped being interested in old ways of working. But nonetheless, it's just, yeah, again, it's just a great way to kind of have new knowledge about what he was doing with what he had at hand.
And I just want to add to that as a conservator, we get really detail-focused, materials-focused. But working with curators, that's a really important relationship that kind of brings you out of that, you know, care and aesthetic position to understand the works differently. And in that case, you know, understanding why he's using splash zone and to the extent that he's using it is also important to our care and conservation of it. So this is a really important relationship to have and foster in a museum.
And it's one that can also be kind of tense sometimes because we're kind of at odds, right? I mean, both of your roles are to make sure that this work is preserved for posterity. And again, like I was saying at the beginning of the talk, that really kind of means they should be locked up, you know, in a refrigerated vault. And that's totally at odds with what we try to do as curators, which is to share work with as, you know, many publics as we can, including traveling the work. So for instance, with the Royal Academy show that's coming up, we had to kind of negotiate what we could loan to it from our Dial collection because of all the knowledge that we have now about just the fragility of certain works. And so that's just kind of always a balance that we have to strike as a museum staff that works collaboratively together, is to both share, you know, the works by these important artists with as many people as possible, but not to do so in a way that would create an impossibility of their being seen by generations to come.
We have a question right over here.
After you have done all this research and all of this documentation, where do you go next? Do you do anything to better conserve his works? Do you do anything to improve, fix, or where do you go from here?
It's a great question, and that's again the stage that we've been in for the past year are actually treating the works. So the kinds of the images that Paula showed of like those diagrams that recorded the visual analysis, and the recommendations that this team of conservators, not just Kristen, made based on all these different kinds of analysis. We're taking them and we're applying them. So we're doing things like we're surface cleaning all of the works was a kind of universal recommendation for every single work out of this process. Was there's a dust layer that's detrimental to the work because dust kind of creates these chemical reactions, or it can cause them to kind of speed up. But at the same time, how do you clean a Dial work that's using materials that were dirty, you know, when he chose them and loved them and embraced them for that dirtiness, right? Like, what do you do you're not going to try to make everything squeaky and shiny, because that wasn't what he wanted. You know, he wanted these objects to carry forward the lives of their past. And so, you know, so we're doing a light surface cleaning, for instance. That's the kind of decision that we make in that case. For the cycle that I showed you that was on that wall over there, this cycle of 4 wall reliefs and then 1 freestanding sculpture, that's the one that we're finding that has the greatest need, and that we're still kind of working on works from that series, because these are cases where pieces have moved, right? Like, because it's this heavy metal elements that he affixed, and this is part of what the study revealed, not to wood, unfortunately, which probably could have held them better, but to like composite board, like the kinds of composite board that you might find in like an office divider type situation. And so his kind of fastenings, his nails and his staples, they're not holding. And so in that case, we're going to create, we might reattach some pieces. We're going to definitely create like stirrups, essentially, supports for these works while they're hanging or laying flat in storage, so that the kind of slippage that's already happening doesn't get worse. Another thing that we're implementing is to create this, to avoid this issue around dust in the future. We're creating these amazing like covers that are going to hang on top of the works that stay on screens, so that dust doesn't accumulate in the same way that it has been. So there's lots of different things that we're doing that comes as a result of all of this. But what's amazing about this and what we've shared with you tonight is that it creates, again, this unprecedented baseline, this documentation of his work, his surfaces, his layers that never existed before. And this means that, and all of this is replicable, right? But hopefully people won't have to re-X-ray the works in the future. But the point being that we are going to be able to better monitor those kinds of changes. So we can't prevent them from happening, but we can catch them more quickly as they are happening and try to create solutions for them, if that makes sense.
Okay, we'll take our last question.
I was just wondering how, like, when you say you surface clean, like, physically, how do you clean? Not like repairing the loss and object conservation, but like actually just cleaning the piece. What does that entail?
Lindsay, it's like, I mean, it's a little vacuum, right? It's like a little teeny, gentle vacuum.
We use a special museum vacuum that has a mesh over the top of it, so if anything comes off of the piece, we can capture it and it doesn't get sucked into the vacuum, but the dust goes through the vacuum. And then we just use very soft brushes and take our time.
That's Lindsay Ryder, who's the objects conservator with the Atlanta Art Conservation Center now. So she and her colleagues, Amanda Casman, who I think is there, and Snow Fain, they're, again, the team of conservators who are now working on the actual treatments of these objects.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time. Thank you, Katie, Kristen, and Paula, for giving us such a deep insight into his works. And for everyone in attendance, thank you for attending, and I hope you have a good evening.
Thank you so much.